Stand will no longer bother us for this part of the presentation. So I'd like to begin by thanking Jorge and the Center for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's a lot warmer than where I'm from, so always a pleasant surprise. Much of what I'm going to say was covered a bit in the morning session, and so I'm hoping maybe I can just provide a little bit more framing and context to think about change. And I think part of what I'm going to be trying to say is that we tend to think about both Cuban Americans in South Florida and Cuba as a nation as sort of frozen in amber in some senses, that both are fixed in time and that there's no movement. And at least I think that's the public perception and discourse, except for the results from that infamous exit poll that we talked about this morning. And so to just think about what it is that's been moving in both those places and what it might mean for the future of Cuban American politics. I guess since I'm here, I should also, as a caveat, say I'm Cuban American, but I am of those not from Miami, so that small 30% of people who chose not, or whose families chose not to be here. So I'm from LA, actually. So some of what I say will probably be colored by the fact that that's my personal background. So we talked about this a little bit. So the two things to think about is both Cubans are different from some other national origin groups. Central Americans tend to have large foreign-born populations as well. But you have almost 60% of Cubans in the United States who are foreign-born, which is a pretty high number. What is unique, many people in this room probably know, but just to remind those who might not know, is that Cuban Americans have an or Cubans who come to the United States have an expedited process of getting through the immigration system. And so they have a much faster route to permanent residency than other national origin groups, and they also therefore then have an earlier opportunity to become citizens. But I should also point out, and what we saw this morning was that even though it's easier for them, they can become citizens usually sooner upon arrival than other Latino national origin groups. They still are subject to all of the costs, fees, and rules associated with that process. And so it's difficult often. If you think about now, you're talking almost $700 just to put in your application, and that doesn't count all of the other money people often spend either for health reviews, for working with lawyers in order to get the papers done properly. Manuel Pastor at USC estimates that it costs about $2,000 for each person to go through the naturalization process. And if you imagine in a family of 5, that's a pretty significant financial investment and investment in time. And so that, I think, helps to explain why the newer arrivals within even the Cuban community are not as likely to have naturalized than people who've been here for a while. So as we saw this morning, while just under half of those foreign-born entered the United States before 1990, a third have entered since the year 2000. And I do think, perhaps outside of this room, this is something that very few people are talking about in terms of having a very significant Cuban migration that has not been mentioned in public discourse and understanding. There's a lot of public discourse around the 1960s migration. There was a lot of public discourse around the Mariel boat lift, and that this is a very significant number of people. You have over 300,000 Cubans becoming legal permanent residents between 2002 and 2011, and yet there isn't a sense, I think, at least nationally, that this is something to be commented on. And it is a real change, which is a product, I think, both of the fact that the United States has been honoring its agreement to provide the visas that they promised in the 1995 changes into the immigration accords, and also other changes that are going on the island. But it's reasonable to assume, because these individuals have been socialized in a different political environment, are coming to a very different Florida than the folks who arrived in 1960, we could imagine that these Cubans may look different 20, 30 years from now than the ones who have been socialized up until this point. And that we don't really know now that, which I'm going to talk about a little bit at the end, now that travel restrictions on the island have been lifted, whether or not that's going to significantly increase this trend over time. And so again, this is something, it's a big change that I think there hasn't been a lot of discussion about. And it speaks to that idea of fixity within Cuban Americans in the United States. So I'm quoting here I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm not going to present any new information of my own, but a study that was done that was published a couple years ago that did both a generational analysis. So in the morning there was a lot of discussion about how Cuban Americans are going to change the future of Cuban politics. So they compared differences across generations, so whether you were US born versus foreign born, and then differences across cohorts. And they found that the bigger differences are actually across cohorts, right? So that it's important to think about, and again, this was talked about a little bit this morning, differences in voting patterns. You have lower levels of citizenship and voting among those who arrived after Mariel. You have lower levels of participation when you break up the Cuban vote, so that the voting Cuban population is actually very different than the population as a whole. And in that way, strangely, Cubans are similar to other Latino national origin groups where the people who are involved in the political process are not necessarily representative of the entire population. Think about Mexicans, they have such low levels of voting. In fact, many Mexicans don't have a voice in the political system. The same is true for Cuban Americans and Cubans who've arrived after 1980. And the ways in which that matters is thinking about attitudes. And some of this was talked about this morning. I'm going to try to provide a little bit more quantification of this. So if you do probabilities and you break out people after the Mariel, you basically have twice as much of a likelihood of supporting lifting the embargo if you arrived after Mariel as those who did before, right? So a pretty significant difference. You have a 20 percentage point difference in terms of probability of saying that you support lifting the travel ban. You have 2.5 times difference in terms of likelihood of identifying a strong Democrat, so related to the party ID stuff we saw this morning. And at least in this study controlled for differences in age, income, education, and still found these differences. So a pretty significant cohort effect in thinking about what are the attitudes of Cubans and Cuban Americans depending upon when they arrived in the United States. And then as we saw this morning, you have a similar difference, sorry, I have no idea what this is, okay. Among the US born, if not as striking, still somewhat of a difference, right? I do think it's funny as a second generation Cuban American when people call us young Cubans, we're not so young anymore. And some of us have kids, so in fact the second generation is aging just as rapidly as the first generation. And I think it's important to think about, you now have 1, 2, 3, and sometimes 4 generations in the United States, and what does that mean from a socialization standpoint? Generally speaking, second generation Cuban Americans are less likely to identify as Republican and more supportive of normalized relations, but again, the differences are smaller. So if we think about the cohort differences, the magnitude, and think about this, so looking at the same probabilities from that study, you had a 7 percentage point difference. So rather than double, small difference, but statistically significant differences, and then a 3 percentage point difference in terms of party ID. Not huge, but somewhat of a change, right? So cohort is more important than generation, but generation is still important. The other thing to really think about is where all this comes from. And Darío, I'm assuming, is going to talk about this a little bit, him being the premier expert on party identification among Cubans. But what he has argued in his work is that if you look, as late as 1979, a majority of Cubans in Florida identified as Democrats. And that it really was both the combination of Reagan and his very strong anti-communist stance during his run for the presidency, and the fact that the Democratic Party in South Florida was not letting Cubans run, right? Was not allowing them on to the ballot, meant the Republicans were like, we're gonna lose anyway, we don't care, y'all can go amongst yourselves and run for office. And what was shocking was that they won, right? And the reason that they won is because of their geographic concentration and overwhelming bloc voting. And then once they won, you solidified this identity of Cubans as Republicans. But we need to remember that in other parts of the country, that identity is not there. Now granted, it is possible that Cubans who chose to settle outside of Miami are just different, that they chose to settle because they had different ideologies or they had different political proclivities, who knows. But it does seem that the socialization experiences of Cubans outside Miami-Dade, granted it's only 30% of the population, are different. And so this, again, when you're looking at surveys with Cubans, you should always take everything with a grain of salt. The sample sizes are always small. FIU is one of the few places that actually knows how to do this and do this well. These are numbers from the Latino National Survey, which has a decent Cuban sample, but not a great Cuban sample. And you have to remember, not everybody answers every question. So for each question, you're going to have smaller numbers because some people just choose not to give you an answer. So these are the folks who gave an answer to the party question and said they were partisan. Because not everybody said they were partisan, but if you look, the blue bar is Republican identification within that survey, and the purple bar is Democrat identification, right? So those who are in Florida, and again, these numbers are a lot stronger than what we saw this morning. They're also from 2006, so they don't reflect whatever changes happened in 2008 and 2012, but it really speaks to that contextual difference, right? The fact that where you land, and therefore then how you're socialized into politics, really does affect these identifications and voting patterns, even among Cubans. And so we need to remember that Bob Menendez, even though he was elected with lots of people other than Cubans, is a Democrat, right? CS is a Democrat. So we have a lot more Democrat representation among Cubans outside of Florida, and that is important if those Cubans who are coming now disperse more than the ones who came previously. We don't know what's going to happen, but it is something to think about, and to remember that then those Cubans who are coming now to Florida are also going to be socialized in a different political environment, even in Florida, than the folks who came 40 years ago. So just remembering that context matters. And also remembering, and this speaks to the presentation this morning, that Cuban political ideology has never mapped very nicely onto Republican Party platform, right? The only thing, Cubans in the room can disagree with me, but I would argue the only thing that Cubans on the island and Cubans in the United States absolutely agree on is that Jose Marti was a wonderful person, right? One of the few things we will not argue about, right? And if you think about what Jose Marti stood for, the man is a social democrat. He had very clear visions about what kind of society he wanted to create, about redistribution, that there should be a role for the state, that you should have racial equality, right? There are lots of things that he said that in fact many Cubans in the United States still hold on to. The gentleman in the corner talked about union membership. Cubans, generally speaking, are supportive of unions, more so than most Republicans. They're supportive of government services. They're supportive of welfare services. Not surprisingly, given the fact that between 1960 and 1996, it's estimated that the Cuban community received $4 billion in assistance from the US government. Just in 2008, if we count the Cuban-Haitian entrant category, you have $322 million in services, right? People's grandmothers, my grandmothers, I'm sure lots of people in the room, their grandmothers, depended upon SSI and government programs in order to survive once they arrived in the United States. We are the only group, Cubans are, that is at least mostly or almost pro-choice. We have the most favorable abortion attitudes of any national origin Latino group. And, I guess also, not surprisingly, if my family is representative, religiosity tends to be lower if we measure religiosity as the number of times per week that we go to church. Just as an anecdote, I'm married to a Mexican who's a very Catholic family, and my parents were in our house with my husband's family and his tia. It was Saturday, and his tia went to church. And when I told my dad that his tia was going to church, he looked at me and said, "Does she know what day it is?" We don't go to church on Saturdays. That's just not what we do, right? But not that my family's representative, but I think the fact of the matter is we don't look like other Latinos on these other categories. We don't look like Republicans on many of these categories. And so people earlier mentioned the single issue Republican, but the fact is conservative values don't map nicely onto at least what public opinion polls have told us about what Cubans believe in. The last thing I want to talk about a little bit, because we haven't mentioned it so much today, is the fact that there are things changing on the island. We can argue about this in the Q&A, but I would argue things actually are changing on the island. And I think both the Obama administration and national discourse